Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jonathan, for the invitation and for that very kind introduction. I should begin with a disclaimer. I'm not talking about populism in Europe, because populism in Europe would require a much larger analysis than I will offer today. What I'm interested in and what I'm going to talk about is what I see as the relationship between populism and that part of Europe as represented by the European Union. So when I began to think about this, I thought in terms of two steps. First, I want to begin by taking the emphasis off populism and talking about some structural features of the European Union that, in my view, make responding to populism, addressing populism, or even that it generates populism, and that those structural features are very important. And then I will turn my attention to unbundling populism in the EU, populism as a target and driver, populists within the gates. What do I mean by that? I mean the authoritarians at the table, and the EU as an arena for populism. So taking the emphasis off populism in the first instance, and that goes back to that issue of multi-level politics. And I was minded to do this, and this is very, very early, because I want to work on what I call Europe's politics trap, the EU's politics trap. And I have committed to delivering a paper on it next June. So by next June, my thoughts will be much more structured and much more, I will have arrived at a much rounder sense. But I thought in dealing with populism, it was also important to begin here. And I was minded to do this paper because I, for some reason, was rereading Fritz Scharf's 1988 Joint Decision Trap, which is one of the most seminal articles about the EU, in which he argues that, and it's a comparison between the EU and German federalism, he argues that these multi-level governance systems generate suboptimal policies and frequently stalemate. And that article itself then led to a very significant research agenda where people actually began to look at this so-called joint decision trap and whether or not it existed. And in fact, if you look at the work of Adrienne Héritier or Gerda Faulkner, and Gerda Faulkner, I participated with her on another special issue much more recently in 2015 on whether or not the crisis had led to a joint decision trap in the EU. But both the Héritier-Faulkner work 2011, but also the more recent work, tells us, in fact, that the EU governance system has quite a number of strategies and mechanisms and channels to avoid the joint decision trap. And these are the roles of international actors, particularly courts, but not just courts, the role of the Commission, the nature of decision rules in the EU, the iterative nature of EU negotiations, that this is a game that's constantly played, and that the delegated nature of day-to-day policymaking. And even in the euro crisis, despite the fact that the EU went into that crisis without the policy instruments to deal with the enormity of what it faced, it muddled through and on occasion managed to muddle up, did a lot more muddling through than muddling up. So the argument I'm going to make today is that perhaps that the joint decision trap is not where the real trap in the EU is, but it's a politics trap. And what do I mean by that? I mean, firstly, the relationship in two senses, the relationship between politics in the EU and policy, and the relationship between politics and the polity. So politics in both directions, politics and polity on the one hand, and politics and policy on the other. And that my core argument is that multi-level governance has outstripped the capacity of the EU for multi-level politics. So firstly, to the politics and policy. And here I rely on Lowy's categorization of policy, his argument policy makes politics, his fourfold categorization of constitutive politics, regulatory politics, distributive politics, and redistributive politics. And if you look at that, then what you can conclude is that most of the dynamic of policy in the EU is at the upper end of that quadrant. In other words, that the EU is characterized by, firstly, constitutive politics. Why? Because it's a polity in the making. It doesn't have a stable constitutional order. It's an order that's constantly, or has been, it engages in iterative periods of treaty change. And of course, under European law and the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, treaties are constitutional documents. They are primary documents in the EU. So the EU has a lot of constitutional politics. It had a particularly strong period of constitutional politics between the mid-1980s and the Lisbon Treaty, 5 episodes of treaty change and very significant treaty change. And of course, constitutional politics in the EU is not just about how it does its business, it's also about who's included. In other words, the whole accession process, and we've had 4 rounds of enlargement. And constitutional politics are not at an end in the EU. One doesn't know when there will be an attempt at another process of treaty change, but it would be foolish to think that treaty change has come to an end. I think it is something that all heads of state and governments in Europe worry about because they're not sure they could ratify, but it certainly hasn't come to an end. And then the other side, regulatory politics, that is the dominant form of public power in the EU. In other words, single market, environmental, social, rules and regulations around banking and finance, etc., etc. In other words, integration through law is the dominant source of public power that the EU has. When you go to the other side, distributive politics, not so much, very limited in the EU. I do mention the common agricultural policy, and I was quite struck that President Macron thought that even the common agricultural policy is ripe for reform, and when a French president begins to say that, things have really shifted. But then the redistributive politics, and that's where the EU really struggles. And if you look at the Eurozone crisis or look at the refugee crisis, the real challenge to the EU was how you dealt with a who pays crisis, because the Eurozone crisis was who pays and who took the risks, and burden sharing. And whenever it comes to burden sharing, the EU struggles. So the EU integration through law has had a very long and successful span of integrating quite diverse states. It remains extremely important to the EU. Regulation through law has not and will not disappear, but the EU struggles particularly on the burden sharing and redistribution. And there's another way of saying that, and that is instruments of governance. In other words, if you have policies that are led by rules, the EU can do this. It is a generator of an extraordinary and very extensive and very large acquis. Those of us who know the EU well know that that's an unending acquis, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of law. But if you're thinking about resource-led, in other words, policies that require the investment of resources, then that's again where the EU struggles. So, and the move, we're at a time in integration where the EU is under extraordinary functional pressure to retain the rules as a dynamic of integration, but it has to be a rules plus entity. In other words, burden sharing, redistribution, solidarity, how it can cope with that side of the politics is really very, very, very complicated for it. So in other words, the way in which the EU has developed the predominance of rules and law, of negative integration, the member states they find it much easier to agree to what thou shalt not do, to what you cannot do. In other words, you cannot do state aids beyond certain constrictions. So the EU, that's part of the DNA, thou shalt not. but it has extremely limited public finance capacity. I have worked on the EU public finances. That capacity, limited as it is, has been extremely important in the dynamic of integration, but it's a 1%. And if you think in Europe today, governments spend anywhere between 35 and 45% of gross product. Public power in financial terms remains very national. Europe at 1% of public finance resources, but it's not just that. There isn't a strong capacity, for example, Frontex, the organization that's responsible for European borders, relies on what the member states will give it. So those areas that require the investment of state resources, the EU really struggles. And this affects the EU in two ways. Firstly, and here I go back to my fond colleague who spent a lot of time in this country, Peter Mayer, when he argued the responsiveness-responsibility continuum. And the lack or weakness of resources at EU level inevitably affects its capacity to be responsive and therefore affects its output legitimacy. So the policy mix in the EU has particular characteristics that mean that it can do certain things with great efficiency and effectiveness, and it can't do other things, and that has consequences. Then moving on to the second, the politics and the polity. The EU is, call it a multi-level polity, a compound polity, and it has very robust multi-level governance. If you look at in micro detail across an enormous range of policy areas at the ties that bind the member states, they're extremely strong. The civil servants in ministries, the domestic agencies, they get tied into a system that is truly transnational right across the range of what governments do. But we are still living in a Europe, and I don't think this is going to change, where there is a preeminence of national politics. In other words, national politics is about national office. Parties are much more focused on national office goals, national elections, than they are, for example, and I'll talk later about the European elections. But what happens in domestic politics affects clearly what can be done in this transnational multi-level space. And what we see in domestic politics today across Europe is much more volatility than we have ever seen before. There's volatility in terms of parties and their capacity to act. There's volatility in terms of party systems. There's a shrinking of the center in party systems, but there's also the appearance of movements. And those of you who work on parties know that the political parties we now have are not the political parties that existed 20 years ago. And of course, there's volatility in terms of political behavior. So to sum up on the first part of what I want to say, that because of the policy mix and the nature of the polity, and also that the EU itself was, in a sense, designed and structured to contain politics and to obfuscate power. It really was designed to try to obfuscate where power lay, to distribute it across the system. In other words, process to trump politics. And in my view, that has left us with this system whereby you have inevitably much more politics in and around the EU and politicization, but the actual infrastructure of transnational politics in Europe is extremely weak. So that's the first argument I want to make, and I think that has consequences for the way in which the EU operates. But of course, it also has consequences for the EU and populism. So now I want to go on to unbundle the European Union and populism. So, the EU as a target. If you think of the EU project, and this is right from the beginning, right from its formative period in the early 1950s, it is a quintessential centrist political project. It received its strongest initial political backing from Christian democracy, and gradually European Social Democrats were co-opted into the system. But it's an inverted U-curve. In other words, support for the EU is strongest in the centre, centre-left and centre-right, but that's where it's strongest. It's not just centrist because of the parties that supported it. It's also centrist because it is a very strong compromise-oriented system. This is a system that requires either unanimity on certain things, treaty change requires unanimity, but for everything it requires supermajorities. This is not a simple majoritarian system. For everything that is done, it requires either very significant qualified majority votes or unanimity. And even though the day-to-day operation of the council is not driven by voting, they do vote, but they don't vote as much as they could vote. Why? Because there is inbuilt around the table is the sense that you try to get the highest level of agreement among the greatest number of actors around the table. In other words, you're striving all the time for compromise. You're striving all the time for consensus. So, in other words, it is really a system that works hard at keeping everyone on board. And because it involves 28 countries, and because it involves a complex set of institutions whereby you don't have a clear separation of powers, you have a very clear separation of powers between the judicial arm, the ECJ, and everything else, but you have a co-executive between the Council and the Commission, and you have a co-legislative system between the Council and the Parliament. So both in terms of substance of what the EU does, and in terms of procedure, you cannot drain this system from complexity. It is inevitably a very complex system. And there's a very high premium placed in this system on the role of knowledge, expertise. The Commission is a knowledge institution. It's a generator of knowledge, but it also sucks in knowledge. It starts with, the studies, the consultations, the immediate, the longer term. And of course, it develops around it and around every single Directorate General in the Commission, there is a very significant and very layered form of expertise. And of course, also evidence. So the Brussels bureaucracy and the agencies are there to draw evidence, to draw knowledge, and to arrive at policy propositions that can fly across an extraordinarily diverse Europe, 28 countries. So at least 28 for now. And there is in Brussels what you would refer to in Washington as the Beltway. There is a Brussels Beltway now, which is very like Washington. All the lobbyists, as the EU gained in salience through the 1990s, domestic actors gravitated towards Brussels. So lobbies increased, the number of lobbyists in Brussels increased, the range increased, so in other words, there is an insider group in every policy area in that beltway. So for the populists, the EU is the other. In other words, if you think about the political logic of populism, the people versus the elite, and that's one of the standard definitions, that there is a people and there is an elite. And if you want something that represents the people versus the elite, then the EU is a good place to start. It is an elite project. It began as an elite project. It couldn't have begun any other way. It began in the 1950s, war-torn, post-war Europe. It wasn't something that you could have built from the ground up. But it's not just that it's an elite project, but it is what it does. Its DNA, what it aims to do, if you read the text, is an area without internal frontiers to the free movement of goods, people, etc., etc. In other words, it is boundary reducing. It is about liberalization and increasing competition. It's about mobility of individuals. And there also is a layer in the EU of what one might call Euro-nationalism. In other words, it hasn't forgotten about the symbols that nationalists have used to build up nation states. We all now, those of us who come from a European country, we carry a passport that tells us we are citizens of our country and citizens of the EU. There's the anthem, the flags. There are identifiers of being part of this system. But that's a very top-down process. The whole People's Europe was top-down, the flag, the anthem, etc., etc. Secondly, the political style of populism is simplified messages and simple politics. In other words, that wonderful statement that won the British election, and more than any other, the take back control, which was the most powerful slogan in the Brexit referendum, and the Remainers didn't come close to matching it in terms of its resonance, taking back control. But what do you do in the EU? You can't have simplified political style because you can't escape from complexity. But you do have, the EU is a target of populists, and in my view, an easy one. And here I give you just two, Farage, and of course the other, populism in Europe is also transnational. They're talking to each other, they're meeting each other, they're coalescing in the European Parliament, etc., etc. Farage, we will exit a failed political union, a disaster zone. We see a migrant crisis utterly out of control, a Eurozone crisis causing human misery on a shocking scale. For Farage, he had two political projects. One, to take the United Kingdom out of the EU, but also the disintegration of the EU itself. And not all Eurosceptics want to see the EU collapse. They want a different EU, but Farage is one of those that would like to see the house coming down. And he would particularly, and if you watch the hard Brexiteers now in the UK, they would feel vindicated if you had the disintegration of the EU, because it would justify the decision to leave the EU. And then Le Pen, what is at stake in this election is the continuity of France. I mean, existential, the future of France as a free nation, our existence as a people, and the battle between the patriots and the globalists. And of course, the populists are the patriots, and the cosmopolitans are clearly the globalists. But we also have to think of the EU not just as a target of populists, but also a driver of populism. And I would say two particular areas where it has been a driver. Firstly, the Eurozone crisis. The Eurozone crisis was characterized by unbalanced adjustment. The cost of adjusting to the Eurozone crisis was taken by the countries least able to do it. In other words, the famous gyps, I won't say pigs, but those countries that were debtor states were the ones that had to engage in really significant internal devaluation and deep austerity policies. And that did strengthen in the Mediterranean, in Greece and in Spain, it strengthened left-wing populism. There's no doubt Syriza would never have gained power, would have been a relatively marginal party in Greece without the Eurozone crisis. Unbalanced adjustment and austerity. And it wasn't so much, it was the fact that there wasn't any leeway in the system, and that goes back to the public finance question. What might have made a difference to countries that were engaging in the adjustment would have been something like some injection of external capital that wasn't just to make sure that they kept paying the banks, but more something targeted towards unemployment or whatever. But the Eurozone crisis undoubtedly had a major impact in Europe and also a very significant impact on attitudes towards the EU. The refugee crisis, and I would say not just the refugee crisis, but the EU, if you again go back to Brexit, is seen as a source of mobility. So when the Brexiteers argued for controls of immigration in the United Kingdom, they were as worried about Poles and Lithuanians and Latvians as they were about non-EU migration. It was the mobility. But I think that the system, the Schengen system in the EU, if you basically void the borders, which is what Schengen did, and you don't secure the external borders of a polity, then you are setting up for a problem. And it did come home to roost. I think in terms of the refugee crisis, because of course Europe has not just a moral responsibility, but also a legal responsibility under international law. So why was that summer of 15, why did it appear so significant? I think partly it appeared as if it was ungovernable. And there's nothing that makes societies uneasy more than an appearance that no one's in charge or no one knows how this is going to play out. And of course, the refugees in 2015 weren't just any refugees, but they were coming from a predominantly Muslim society. And as there was an interesting paper this morning on nativism in this country and the creation of the other. But what the EU does or does not do, it can also be a driver of populism. I want to say something about populism and Euroscepticism because in a way we sometimes use them interchangeably. And I would argue they are distinct but interconnected. Why distinct? Well, populism is not confined to Europe. We've seen very significant populism in Latin America, and we now have a North American version in Trump. And also, Euroscepticism is not always populist. In other words, there was for a very long time in Europe, and it was particularly a strategy of the larger parties and the mainstream parties, that the EU was taboo. In other words, there was no debate about the EU. And the European Union is not just a polity, it's a political project. And like all political projects, must be open to contestation and to critique as any other political project. So one shouldn't equate Euroscepticism necessarily with populism, but it is an empirical fact that all radical right-wing parties in Europe are Eurosceptic. All of them, without exception. And they have combined an anti-immigration and anti-EU party platform. And which I'm not so sure, but there's no doubt that they are connected. And when it comes to Euroscepticism, populist parties use Europe, of course. It is available to them as a target. It is available to them as an issue that they can politicize. Interestingly, and here I think there is a shift, those parties that now deliberately target the EU in political platforms aren't necessarily getting the traction they once did. So where do I see this? Le Pen was both very anti-EU and very anti the euro. And this simply did not fly with the French electorate. And she's been backtracking from the anti-euro. And again, you see in other jurisdictions, there's a tendency now to not be quite as using Europe as a target as there once was. And I think that's the Brexit effect, but I'll talk about that later. There's also the fact that mainstream parties tried to contain the European issue and not put it on the agenda, and therefore it was an available issue to protest or challenger parties. And we also see that parties in opposition tend to be more Eurosceptic than when they actually have to govern. Populists at the EU table. For me, this is probably the single biggest constitutive challenge facing the EU today. The EU is always an admixture between politics and diplomacy. And sitting round a European Council table, heads of government tend to be extremely diplomatic to each other. They behave as if they're heads of government or heads of state of another country. But of course, the stakes now, it is a highly politicized system. What instruments does the EU have to handle those who breach the core values of the EU? Well, the EU treaties are extremely clear on the foundational values of the system. Article 2 could not be clearer. And then there's Article 7 that allows for a procedure and process whereby a country can be sanctioned, firstly a dialogue and then a sanctioning. This was seen as a nuclear option. This was not seen as something that would have to be used, but there are now the preliminary Article 7 processes occurring in relation to Poland. But of course, the big problem with Article 7 is you need the unanimity of the remaining member states. And if you've more than one authoritarian round the table, they're going to cover each other's backs. So the treaties the EU has some leverage, but nothing like the leverage it had before countries became member states. In other words, neither Hungary nor Poland today would be admitted to the EU. Neither of them would be given signed treaties of accession. It just wouldn't happen. But now they're there and they're at the table. And Hungary, Fidesz, Orban 2010, you could argue perhaps not radical right, but certainly over the last couple of years, I find it very difficult to not categorize Fidesz and Orban as radical right. And the fact that he got away with it for so long makes it all the more difficult to do something about it. And he's being protected by the European People's Party, and it's outrageous. And the protection is all to do with numbers, to ensure that the EPP is the largest party in the European Parliament, and to ensure that they get the office benefits that go with that. The Commission is now taking infringement proceedings against Hungary, both for its law on the NGOs and the CEU, the Central European University. But it strikes me that Orban's view is that the EU can do nothing about me, is unwilling to do anything about me, and I can get away with it. That's my sense of, I see no evidence that any push from the EU is working with Orban. Poland, 2015, the Commission has initiated a rule of law dialogue with them. That's Article 7, that's important. They have abolished the Constitutional Tribunal. They've abolished the Constitutional Court and the way in which they've altered the way in which judges are chosen. So what we see in both Hungary and Poland is electoral democracy that is illiberal and truly authoritarian. And for me, the weakness of the EU in handling this is very problematic. And I would say the stakes are high in two ways. Firstly, the functional basis for this, defending EU values. The EU is a system based on law that requires law. And you can't have judicial cooperation unless there's trust, a fair judicial system, and legal certainty. And so, it's not just what they're doing in their own countries, but they're potentially damaging the EU legal system itself with open defiance. And after a recent ECJ judgment, there were some comments from a senior member of the Orban government that suggested that the ECJ had no standing. Now, he did row back because one of he did row back, but the very fact that he could say it in the first place. So there's a strong functional argument that the EU has to defend its values. In my view, there's a strong normative argument in that the weakening of the core values of the EU weaken it from within. And you can't then turn around and say to Turkey, well, you can't become a member state of the EU because you've an authoritarian government and you've an authoritarian regime if you have the Orbáns, etc., etc. And we don't know, and it's live politics, whether that authoritarian axis in the EU is growing. Austria, the Freedom Party, came in as the third largest party, but I think the Social Democrats had 52 seats and the Freedom Party had 51. Most likely will form the next government in Austria. Kurz, the new People's Party, as he called it, not just the People's Party, but the new People's Party, he moved radically to the right in the election in terms of an anti-immigration stance. We don't know what kind of government we'll have in Austria, and of course the Czech elections are yesterday and today, and by all accounts there will be a Prime Minister of the Czech Republic who's rabidly anti-NATO, anti-EU and anti-the West, and very pro-Putin. So is the authoritarian axis growing in the EU, and what's happening democratic politics in the eastern half of the continent? My third cut, the EU as an arena. The EU offers populist parties quite a number of advantages. Firstly, the nature of European Parliament elections themselves. European Parliament elections are low stakes, second order, and lots of Europeans don't bother voting. And those that do can use, at a very low cost, the European Parliament to register discontent. And they do. It also offers significant financial resources to the populists. I have a hypothesis which I can neither prove nor disprove, but it is that had Nigel Farage and UKIP not been successful in European Parliament elections, they would not have had the financial resources to successfully maintain their position in British politics and, in the end, ensure that there was a referendum. It offers them a platform, and it offers them all the transnational contacts. And so you look at the last elections, 98 Eurosceptic MEPs and 48 Eurosceptic Conservatives. In other words, the centrist parties quite squeezed in the European Parliament. And if you see the Eurosceptics have grown significantly over the last period. So where are we now? I think one of the things that, because populism is also not just the subject of academic work, but is also a live, hot issue in society and in the media, you tend to get, waves of interest in populism, but also 2016 with Trump and Brexit, we heard that the populists were taking over, that they were emboldened. And then, interestingly, 2017, and you have the Dutch elections and then the French elections, and suddenly the threat is over, and now that you have the Austrian elections and the Czech elections, you're going to get another wave of the populists are taking over. So what's the evidence? Well, Cas Mudde argues, and he's right, and the evidence is there, that populists are more successful now than they ever have been before. On average, 15% across Europe, but of course, dramatic variation across member states. In other words, populist radical right parties in particular, much stronger in some countries than in the others. But there's also the underlying structural shifts we see in politics, Hans-Peter Kresi, that national political community is changing. It's under strain. It's under strain political competition, new centres of power like the EU, economic competition, the liberalisation, not just of the EU single market, but globalisation, and also cultural competition. And what we're also seeing in Europe is the decline of social democracy. the fact that once powerful parties just have lost traction in this country, but clearly in the German election, in the Austrian election, etc., etc. They lost, in a sense, ideologically. It's as if social democracy couldn't get a handle on globalization, and that now they're losing institutionally and electorally. So, what else do we see happening in Europe? Well, we had the Macron phenomenon, and the Macron phenomenon was interesting in that, but it was also the reaction of the pro-Europeans in the UK after Brexit, that they woke up. They suddenly realized that with Brexit there was something to lose. And Macron was one of the first European leaders who actually actively campaigned on a pro-European platform, was very comfortable. And this was interesting in France, that it happened someone in a French election, that there was someone who would do this, because France has always been very comfortable with the EU, provided it's l'Europe par la France, or la France par l'Europe. In other words, the more like France Europe is, the better it is. But Macron did it. He also is willing to fight. He's willing to make the political case for Europe. His Sorbonne speech, which was extraordinarily long, an hour and a half. Someone should have told him no one can listen for more than 45 minutes, and that's a stretch. But it was his language. I've come here to talk about Europe, to transform this old fight, etc., etc. And he used the term, we have forgotten to stand up. We have forgotten to stand up to Europe. Now, Macron is one political leader among many. And so the question is, has Macron, or can he, with others, generate a level of consensus in the EU that would take it beyond where it now is in terms of the blockages? And my sense is that it's going to be extremely difficult. He will have a very difficult domestic agenda, a reform agenda, but in a way he's got to fight, he's got to address the reform agenda domestically with a European overlay. He's got to get something from Europe that helps him domestically. And a lot will depend on what happens on the other side of the Rhine. In other words, what the Jamaica coalition, if there is a Jamaica coalition, will do. Is there any room in the German system to move this along? So I would say that there is a very small flicker of a new agenda in the EU. It's minor. It's unsure whether or not it will get sufficient traction. But it is that I'm noticing a lot in the discourse on a Europe that protects. And protect is a word that can cover a multitude. Protect in terms of welfare, protect in terms of security, protect for the future, climate, etc., etc. In other words, to move the EU beyond a Europe that liberalizes and that opens and that allows for mobility, but that also offers something for those who are not mobile, who stay in place. Where are the kinds of areas that one might see developments, or already have? Clearly defense and security. And there are two reasons for that. One is the Trump commitment to the defense, to the transatlantic alliance is weak at best. And Europe, unlike the United States, finds itself in an extraordinarily troubled area. The Arab Spring turned into the Arab nightmare, and certainly, and we spoke in the last session on the Mediterranean, that's a very unstable bundle of countries on the other side of the Mediterranean, and as you go further south in Africa, there's a lot to worry about. A Europe which invests. One of the most extraordinary things about this period is that at a time when money was really cheap, why did Europe, and Germany in particular, not use some of its savings to invest in its future, which would have helped everyone else? And that is Europe now needs to invest and probably save a little less, but of course, given the age demographics, one sees why the saving. Climate change is, again, climate has to be done at every level. I would say taxation of multinationals, multinational mobile capital, the Facebooks and the big internet companies who are paying very little tax anywhere in the world. Europe can get a grip, at least some grip on this, and may do something. So I do see some changes happening in the policy balance over time, but the EU is still left with that weak infrastructure of multi-level politics, which makes it very difficult. In other words, the input side of the European Union remains extremely weak. Thank you.